It started in a crowded London courtroom, whispers, murmurs, tension thick as fog. The accused stood silent, and just as the verdict was about to fall, someone coughed. A small, harmless sound, but Sherlock Holmes froze, because hidden inside that cough was something no one else could hear, a pattern, a rhythm, a message. Within seconds, Holmes knew the case wasn't over. The cough wasn't illness. It was communication, a coded warning buried in plain sound. And behind it lay a plot so intricate, only Holmes could untangle it before the city itself fell into chaos. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe, because every case we explore hides a clue waiting just for you. Now, pick up your cup of tea, sit back, and get ready to lose yourself in the mystery of Sherlock Holmes and the puzzle hidden in a cough. Chapter 1. The cough that echoed through Silent City was one of those chill, slate-gray afternoons in early November when even the most industrious soul might find his energies curiously dampened. And I found myself curled in an armchair beside the fire of our sitting room at 221B Baker Street. Holmes stood at the window, as was his custom in spells of contemplative idleness, his long fingers steepled below his chin, and his eyes narrowed to the street below, like those of a hawk monitoring the pulse of a sleeping city. Outside, the fog hung thick and soupy, swallowing the outlines of the hansoms and cloaked pedestrians in muffled layers of smoke and drizzle. Inside, the coal crackled faintly, and my recent attempt at reading the Lancet was rendered futile by a subtle, irritating cough that came not from Holmes nor from myself, but rather from the landing. "Someone is waiting," said Holmes at last, not turning from the window. "A client?" I asked, setting the paper aside. "Likely," he murmured. "Anxious, female, lower middle class, boots, foreign, centerkish, rose and clothes. She has coughed precisely 6 times in as many minutes, always when footsteps pass the stairwell. She does not wish to be overheard." Before I could press him further, there came the delicate knock of hesitation, 3 short raps, then silence. "Come," called Holmes. The door opened, and in stepped a woman of no more than 35 years, dressed in a faded coat of gray wool and a dark veil drawn low. She removed her gloves with trembling fingers, revealing a set of worried blue eyes and a pale, drawn face. Her mouth parted, but it was the cough that came first, dry, whispering thing that rasped like wind over dead leaves. Holmes motioned her to sit, which she did with a nod of thanks, still clutching her gloves tightly. I was told to come to you, Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice barely audible over the faint creaking of her chair. "It concerns a death, sir." "But not one that has been reported." "A death," I repeated, leaning forward. Holmes waved a hand toward her. "Let us allow Miss," she interjected. "Miss Eliza Harridge." "Yes, let us allow Miss Harridge to speak uninterrupted. Please begin at the start, and do not concern yourself with appearances. The truth, however odd, is always of greatest interest." The woman swallowed hard. "My brother, Lionel Harridge, died 2 nights ago, but I have not yet notified the authorities." This declaration, so stark and quiet, caused even Holmes to straighten slightly, because she continued, "I do not believe he died of natural causes. And because he left behind something strange. Something I think someone may already be searching for. What precisely did he die of? Holmes asked. He had been ill for weeks with a persistent cough. He called it nothing more than a chill. Refused to see a doctor, of course. But it worsened. That night he collapsed in his study, and by the time I reached him he was gone. And what was left behind? Asked Holmes. His tone crisped. Eliza hesitated. From her coat she drew a crumpled, yellowed envelope. Inside was a folded slip of paper, brittle with age, and stained with an ink blot across the bottom corner. She handed it to Holmes. I leaned close as he unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was fine and cramped, ending abruptly, but what drew the eye was the object affixed to the page, a single strand of curled paper. What looked like the outer wrapper of a lozenge or cough drop beneath it. In Lionel Harridge's handwriting was scribbled, "He coughs because he must. He must because he cannot speak." "What do you make of that, Holmes?" I asked. He was already reaching for his magnifying lens. "Curious," he murmured. "The ink here is not standard C. This sheen. Indian iron gall, often used in archival inks. And the paper, handmade. Older than our friend here might realize." Miss Harridge nodded. "I found it hidden behind one of the panels in the bookshelf. It had been deliberately wedged there. The lozenge paper was inside Lionel's vest pocket. That was the last thing he touched." "Did your brother have enemies?" "None I knew of. He worked at the Ministry of Post-Clerical Work, dry as dust. He spent his evenings cataloging foreign postage and obscure telegram transcripts for the government." Holmes blinked once an infinitesimal motion, but I had seen it before. The spark of interest had lit behind those hawkish eyes. "Miss Harridge," he said slowly, "do you happen to have any of your brother's personal effects? In particular, the coat he wore when he died?" "I have not touched a thing," she said. "His room is as it was. I was too afraid someone would come back for something. The door remains locked." "Good. Then we shall accompany you there at once." She looked startled. Now, Holmes had already fetched his coat. "If someone wanted what your brother hid and failed to find it, they may return, and we must see the scene before their shadow touches it again." I followed him out the door, glancing back at the dying firelight as it flickered against the folded message and the strange lozenge paper lying upon the table. A man had died, ostensibly of a cough, but Holmes already suspected it was the symptom of something deeper, and thus began the case that would lead us down a trail of vanished voices, secret communications, and the most unexpected weapon I had yet seen employed in the course of murder. Chapter 2: The Study. Behind the locked door it was a dismal ride through the waning fog and gaslit streets. Our hansom cab jolting steadily toward the modest neighborhood of North Ealing, where Miss Harridge resided. Holmes sat silently beside me, his gaze turned inward, though I knew his mind was already dissecting the incongruities of our client's tale. From time to time he tapped his long fingers on the side of the seat, a faint rhythm I'd come to associate with intense thought. Miss Harridge, seated opposite, kept her gloved hands folded in her lap, her expression distant. The few questions Holmes put to her during the journey were sparse, precise. "Your brother lived alone?" "Yes, since our father passed last year. I came to stay with him when his cough worsened." "Did he have visitors?" "Very few. A Mr. Travers, who worked with him at the ministry, called once last week, and an older gentleman I never caught his name came by the night before Lionel died. But they argued. Lionel turned him away. Argued over what? I don't know. I only heard raised voices. When I went to check, Lionel simply said, "Don't worry, Eliza. The past has an annoying habit of knocking." Then he laughed, though it was ... strained. Holmes leaned forward, eyes narrowing slightly. "And after your brother died, you said you locked the study." "Yes, with the key. It's still with me." She fished it from her reticule and held it out. Holmes took it without comment. Studying the tarnished brass and its worn teeth, we arrived at a narrow terraced house with ivy, climbing the brick facade, and a low iron gate that creaked ominously as we passed through. Inside, the house smelled faintly of dust and candle wax. Holmes made no comment as Miss Harridge led us up a narrow flight of stairs to the second floor. At the end of the corridor stood the door in question. She paused before it, the key hovering at the lock. "I haven't touched it since," she murmured. Holmes took the key and inserted it with care. The lock turned with a reluctant clunk, and the door creaked open into a darkened study. He stepped inside without hesitation. I followed close behind. The room was dim but orderly. Heavy curtains had been drawn over the single window, and the air felt still and stale. Books lined the walls, some stacked too deep. A large mahogany desk stood at the center. Papers arranged in careful piles, a brass lamp on one corner, and an empty teacup resting beside an open ledger. Holmes crossed the room without a word and knelt beside the bookshelf. "Where did you find the note?" he asked. "There," Miss Harridge replied, pointing toward a shelf near the floor. "Behind those volumes on naval history." Holmes pulled them out and tapped the back panel. It yielded slightly. He pressed further, then removed a thin sliver of wood, revealing a shallow recess now empty. He replaced the panel and rose. "Nothing else has been moved." "No, I was too frightened." "Wise?" Holmes's eyes scanned the rest of the study. He moved to the desk, carefully lifting sheets of paper, one at a time. "Watson, observe." I stepped closer. The papers were written in an impressively neat hand, cataloging codes, columns of numbers, acronyms I didn't recognize. At first glance, it appeared administrative in the extreme, but Holmes pointed to a small, precise annotation in the margin of one page. 3 dots arranged in a triangle. "Do you see it?" he asked softly. I nodded. "No, something older." He flipped the page and revealed another, the same 3-dot symbol, repeated again. Then, further down, a short vertical line intersecting a half circle, "I believe," Holmes said. "We are looking not at mere office notation, but at a cipher layered atop a bureaucratic veil. But who would he be writing for? That Watson is the marrow of the matter." Holmes examined the teacup next, raising it to his nose. "Bergamot, Earl Grey, still faint. He drank it perhaps the evening he died." Miss Harridge shifted uneasily. "That was the last cup I brought him. He was in here late, scribbling furiously. Said he had a headache." Holmes placed the cup down and turned his attention to the fireplace. On its mantel stood a glass dish filled with what looked like crumpled paper wrappers, fragments of cough lozenges. By the look of it, he sifted through them silently. "Do you notice anything odd about these?" I leaned in. They were all printed identically, burrows, soothing pastilles for the throat, but several bore strange perforations across their surfaces, as if tiny holes had been punched into them at odd intervals. "Why would someone pierce a lozenge wrapper?" I asked. Holmes gave me a small, satisfied smile. "Precisely." He picked up one such wrapper and held it to the light. The pinholes, though faint, seemed deliberate in arrangement, too precise to be incidental. "A message," I breathed. "Concealed in the unlikeliest form," Holmes said, rolling the wrapper between his fingers. "One cough, one wrapper, each perhaps carrying a word, a number, a signal, brilliantly obscure." There was a sound from the hollow floorboard creaked. Holmes's head turned sharply toward the door. Miss Harridge gasped. "No one else is home." Holmes motioned us both to silence. Then, with the silence of a cat, he crossed to the door and flung it open. The corridor was empty, but on the carpet, just outside the threshold, lay a single Itama burnt matchstick, recently extinguished. Holmes stared down at it, then knelt, touching the smoldering tip with his gloved finger. "We are not alone in our interest," he murmured. And though we could hear no more sounds, the impression of a presence unseen hung heavy in the air. Holmes straightened and closed the door firmly behind him. "This case, Watson," he said softly, "has only just begun to cough." Chapter 3. The man with the smoked collar. It was just past 5 o'clock when we departed the Harridge home. The fog had lifted slightly, but the sun was all but swallowed by a shroud of cloud. Holmes remained uncharacteristically quiet as we boarded a returning cab, his eyes fixed on the soot-streaked rooftops that passed like shadows through the gray air. "What do you make of it all?" I asked, drawing my coat tighter. "I make of it, Watson," Holmes said at length, "that a man has died of a cough, and yet the cough itself speaks more loudly than any witness." I smiled, despite myself. "You believe he was murdered, then?" Holmes turned to me. "I believe," he said slowly, "that Lionel Harridge was a courier of sorts, Watson. Not of packages, but of meaning. Of something small enough to pass for medicine. Something intended to be destroyed or swallowed." My brows rose. "You think the lozenges were the message?" "Not the lozenges themselves. Those are only the carrier pigeons. It is the wrappers, their arrangement and perforation, that interest me. But someone else was clearly interested in them too." He pulled from his pocket the burnt matchstick retrieved from the corridor. A fresh match, still warm when we stepped into the hallway. Our eavesdropper lit it for illumination, or perhaps a signal. Who that, my dear Watson, is what I intend to learn. We arrived at Baker Street and made directly for Holmes's chemistry table. He set the perforated wrapper beneath his magnifying lens, while I lit the fire and fetched a fresh pot of tea. Holmes, meanwhile, produced a small hand mirror and a pin. He held the wrapper up to the gas lamp, allowing the pinholes to cast shadows through the paper and onto the mirror's surface. The result was a crude arrangement of dots and lines like a primitive alphabet. "Ah," he murmured, "not Morse, not Braille, but perhaps something even older." I leaned over his shoulder. "Code, cipher," he corrected. "One likely read by placement rather than character. Positional meaning, like the pig-pen cipher used by the Templars, or a musical notation repurposed to language." He tapped the table thoughtfully, then turned to me. "Watson, we must visit the Ministry of Post tomorrow morning." "On what grounds?" "On the grounds," he said, "that I believe Lionel Harridge was not merely a clerk, but an archivist for classified transmissions. And such a post may have brought him dangerously close to something he should not have read." Before I could reply, Mrs. Hudson knocked gently at the door and handed in a telegram. Holmes took it with his usual calm, but as he read the short note, a flicker of interest touched his eyes. "Curious," he said. Passing it to me, it read, "To Mr. Sherlock Holmes, 221B, Baker Street. Please meet at St. Nicholas Passage before noon. Come alone. Urgent concern R.E. Harridge case. Trust no one. A friend of the Whisper, St. Nicholas Passage," I repeated. "That narrow alley near the docks." "The very one. A delightfully public place for clandestine meetings." Holmes smiled. "And it confirms my suspicion. This is no ordinary matter. Someone knows we are involved. They are either warning us or attempting to lure us. You intend to go." "Naturally, but not alone, and certainly not unaware." The following morning was colder still. We arrived at St. Nicholas Passage by 10:30. Holmes, in a rather shabby ulster and a worn tweed cap that disguised him as an aging surveyor. I followed at a discreet distance, my revolver snug in my coat pocket. The alley was damp and echoing, the kind of place where carts rolled slow and eyes watched from behind broken shutters. Holmes paced slowly along the passage, pausing before a boarded tobacconist's shop with a rusted sign. It was there that the man appeared, almost as if summoned by the wind. He stepped out from behind the angled gate of an adjacent mews, a lean, angular fellow, older than Holmes, with a weathered face and a salt and pepper beard. His coat was frayed at the elbows and bore faint scorch marks along the sleeve. But what struck me most visible, even from where I stood, was the black smear on his collar, ash, not grime. Ash. Holmes raised a hand subtly to stay my approach. The two men spoke in hushed tones for several minutes. The stranger gestured once toward the Thames, then handed Holmes a small, folded item before turning and disappearing back into the maze of alleys. Holmes rejoined me minutes later, holding a folded wrapper similar to the one we'd found at Harridge's home, but this one carefully encased in oilskin. "The man's name is Prentice," Holmes said softly. "Former code analyst for the Navy. He left after a scandal involving intercepted Russian communiques, and now, it seems, he is watching the watchers." He opened the wrapper on my palm. Perforated dots, again this time arranged in a distinct spiral pattern. Holmes said nothing for a long time. Then he whispered. He said Lionel Harridge had uncovered a thread of communications embedded inside domestic telegrams, harmless on the surface, but layered with encoded instructions when folded and aligned. I stared at the tiny wrapper. "And these messages, encrypted between coughs, Watson, distributed through public institutions, embedded in the mundane, invisible unless one knew what to hear." "What kind of messages?" Holmes folded the wrapper again and placed it inside his pocketbook. "That, I suspect, is what got Lionel Harridge killed. But not before he tried to warn someone. And now?" I asked. Holmes looked back toward the alleyway. "Now, Watson, I believe we are not the only ones trying to interpret a cough, but we may be the last to do so while still breathing." Chapter 4: The Gathering of Whisperers. By the time we returned to Baker Street, The fog had once again descended, curling along the gutters like pale smoke and dampening the cobblestones beneath our boots. Holmes remained silent through most of the journey, one gloved hand resting against his lips, the other idly thumbing the spiral perforated wrapper retrieved from the elusive prentice back in the warmth of our lodgings. Holmes settled into his armchair with unusual urgency. I saw that look in his eyes, again the faint glimmer that meant the game had stepped beyond speculation and into strategy. I poured us both a cup of tea, but he barely acknowledged it. "Watson," he said at last, "we are not dealing with a single murder, but a network frayed, hidden, and likely disbanded, but not dead. A network of couriers, agents, perhaps, whisperers, as Prentice cryptically called them, people like Harridge quiet men in quiet posts passing messages under the noses of clerks and constables, but for whom? That," Holmes said, rising abruptly, "is what we must discover. And to do so, we must speak to those who knew Lionel Harridge beyond the official corridors of the ministry. People who knew him well enough to notice when he changed, when the whispers began." He reached for the small card index in his drawer and riffled through it. "I made a note some months ago," he murmured, "of a man named Enoch Glass, an eccentric linguist and part-time analyst who once shared an office wall with Harridge. He was known to the Yard as a harmless oddity fixated on dialects and cough patterns." "Cough patterns," I repeated. Holmes nodded. He maintained that one could identify regional origins not by speech, but by involuntary sound sneezes, hiccups, coughs. It was considered lunacy at the time. Now I wonder if it was something more. Within the hour, we were bundled once more against the damp air, heading for a narrow cul-de-sac in South Kensington. The address led us to a small, ill-kempt townhouse with peeling green paint and a curious brass plaque that read, "E. Glass Phonolinguistic Consultant. Holmes." Knocked. We heard shuffling inside, followed by the unmistakable sound of bolts being drawn. The door opened to reveal a man of indeterminate age, with wild white hair, thick spectacles, and a scarf wound tightly around his neck. Despite the warmth of the interior, "Ah," he said. "You've come." Holmes raised a brow. "You were expecting us." "Not precisely," Enoch Glass said, stepping aside. "But I heard your name spoken last week. In a very particular kind of cough." We exchanged glances, then entered. Glass's study was a marvel of disorder charts pinned across every surface, shelves crammed with phonograph cylinders, notebooks stacked like miniature towers. On the far table sat a phonograph itself, humming softly as a wax cylinder turned. "I recorded your friend, you know," Glass said, gesturing vaguely. "Mr. Harridge, at least." "I think he wished me to, when," Holmes asked, "a week before his death. He visited, unannounced, sat right where you are, said nothing for nearly 10 minutes. Then he coughed, deliberately." Glass nodded. 5 distinct times, with unnatural gaps between. I was fascinated, recorded it at once. He left without another word. "May we hear it?" Holmes asked. Glass moved to the phonograph, adjusted the needle, and flicked a switch. The room filled with the scratchy whisper of a wax recording, then a cough, a short, sharp exhalation, then silence. Another, longer, more ragged. 3 more followed, each spaced precisely, each subtly different in tone. When the final one faded, Glass looked to Holmes expectantly. "Not a pattern of illness?" Holmes said. A pattern of code. Precisely, Glass cried. It mimics the cadence of early sound. Each pause and force of sound corresponds to directional flag positions. I transcribed it. Look here. He handed Holmes a notepad filled with symbols and scribbled notes. At the bottom, in Glass's spidery hand, were the words, "They know." Seal broken. "Do not trust Travers." "Travers?" I murmured. "The same man Miss Harridge mentioned, the co-worker who visited just before Lionel's death." Holmes's expression tightened. If Harridge was transmitting a warning, it may have been his final one. Glass pulled his scarf tighter. "I told no one, you understand. I have no desire to vanish beneath the Thames." "You did well," Holmes said. "One last question. Has Mr. Travers contacted you since?" Glass hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, he came 2 days ago. Asked if Harridge had left anything with me. He seemed polite to polite. His coat smelled of sulfur. His voice ... flat." Holmes turned sharply. "Sulfur." Glass blinked. "Like phosphorus matches. As if he'd been lighting one after another." Holmes turned to me, his voice low. "The burnt match outside the study. It may have been Travers himself." We left Glass's home in a state of heightened alert, the air outside seeming colder still despite the mid-morning light. Holmes spoke little as we returned to Baker Street, but his silence was heavy with focus. Back inside, he drew out the 2 lozenge wrappers Harridge's and the one from Prentisand, laid them beside. "Glass's transcription, they know," Holmes said aloud, tracing the spiral pattern again with a finger. "Seal broken. Do not trust Travers. All contained in a cough, Watson." I watched him work, my mind reeling from the implications. Holmes stood suddenly and fetched his violin from its case. He drew the bow once across the strings. Then another and stopped. "We must meet Travers," he said, "before he coughs again." And with that, he began to play a long, slow, minor phrase that seemed to echo the coughs we had just heard. Each note a riddle held tightly in the chest of a dying man. Chapter 5. Travers at the edge of silence. Following day brought with it a strange stillness, as if the very air in Baker Street had grown cautious. Holmes spent the early hours at his desk, scribbling coded messages onto note cards with his characteristic intensity. He had dispatched 2 telegrams before breakfast, one to the Ministry of Post under a fabricated name, and another to a clerk he referred to only as RJ from Cartwright's Shadow, a contact I had not heard of before, though I knew better than to interrupt. It was not until midday that he turned to me and said, "The trap is nearly set, Watson. Now we go to shake its bait." "You mean Travers?" "Indeed. I have arranged a plausible pretext through the Ministry's personnel records. According to a fictitious inquiry launched by an internal oversight committee, Mr. Lionel Harridge's documents are now under review. That will unnerve Mr. Travers, who is likely wondering how much of Harridge's work was archived or words duplicated." I nodded. "And he doesn't know we already hold 2 of the coded wrappers, which is precisely the advantage we need." Holmes dressed quickly, donning a more formal frock coat and a low-brimmed hat. He took no disguise this time. Today, the truth was to be pursued not from the shadows, but through careful provocation. The Ministry of Post was housed in a tall, dignified building on Whitehall, its limestone facade streaked with soot and fog residue. Inside, the corridors smelled of old paper, leather bindings, and a faint trace of machine oil from the pneumatic tube lines that ran through the lower floors. We were shown into a narrow office filled with shelves of labeled ledgers and baskets of rolled telegrams. At the far end stood a desk, behind which sat a man of middling height, gray-haired and dressed in an immaculately pressed suit. His spectacles caught the gaslight in narrow slivers, and though his face bore the expression of polite interest, there was a stiffness to his jaw that betrayed unease. "Mr. Travers," Holmes greeted, offering a hand. "I am Mr. Theobald, from the Internal Registry Audit Division." Travers rose and shook his hand without comment. "May I ask what the nature of your visit is?" Holmes sat without invitation. "We are following up on several inconsistencies surrounding Mr. Lionel Harridge's catalog logs. His section may have filed documents using improper format, and we need to verify which materials passed through his care during his final month." Travers hesitated, but his response was smooth. Harridge was meticulous. Quiet, yes, but thorough. If he made an error, it would surprise me. Holmes steepled his fingers. Did he ever discuss alternate cataloging methods, symbols, or temporary markings? Anything outside the standard numbering? "Not with me," Travers replied. He kept to himself. I noted how his fingers gripped the arms of his chair ever so slightly. Did he ever express concern about misfiled messages or being watched? Travers gave a tight smile. He worried about dust and drafts. "Mr. Theobald, nothing more." Holmes reached into his pocket and withdrew a blank sheet of ministry paper onto which he had earlier punched a series of small perforations using a compass needle. "We discovered this among his archived effects," he said. "Do you recognize it?" Travers took the page. His eyes flicked across it once, then a second time, slower. He turned it over, then back again. "I see nothing of consequence." "Odd," Holmes said calmly. "Because we have reason to believe this arrangement of pinholes matches a message delivered 3 weeks ago through the internal tube line, and the message originated in this department." Travers remained silent. "Furthermore," Holmes added, "the same pattern appears on a wrapper discovered in Mr. Harridge's coat pocket. We believe he had deciphered its meaning, and that someone wanted to ensure he never passed it on." The pause that followed was long. Travers sat very still, eyes on the paper. Then he cut. Not the dry rasp of a winter chill, but a sharp, deliberate bark. "Curious," Holmes murmured. "That cough." Travers placed the paper on his desk and stood. "If you have further questions," he said, voice tight, "I suggest you refer to the department supervisor. I have work to finish." Holmes rose as well. "Of course. But know this, Lionel Harridge was not the only man watching, and not all coughs go unheard." We stepped into the corridor. Holmes did not speak until we were outside the building. "Did you see it?" he asked. "The cough," I said. "Yes, it was deliberate, and the ring on his finger, stained green beneath the result of constant heat exposure. Matches again, Watson. He's our man. Or at least part of it. What next?" Holmes's eyes narrowed. "He knows we're close, but he doesn't know how close. He will make a move, likely, soon. Either to retrieve what Harridge left behind, or to remove those he believes still hold it." We were halfway down Whitehall when Holmes stopped abruptly and turned his head. behind us. Some 30 yards back, a man in a dark coat and bowler hat ducked into a doorway. He had been following us. "We are being watched," Holmes said flatly. "No, someone else. Quieter, likely sent to learn what we know." We turned the next corner quickly and cut down an alley behind a row of shops, emerging onto a quieter street. "Let us return to Baker Street. The trap has been set. The prey knows it smells wrong. All we must do now is wait for the cough," I finished. Holmes gave a rare nod of approval. "Just so." Chapter 6. The envelope that shouldn't exist. Shadows in Baker Street had grown long and lean by the time Holmes and I returned, the city hushing into twilight. Mrs. Hudson had laid out tea with a plate of oat biscuits, but neither of us touched them. Holmes stood at the window with his back straight, fingers clasped behind him, watching the street below with unblinking focus. "There will be movement tonight, Watson," he said quietly. "Travers is not the sort of man to sleep soundly when a fuse begins to burn beneath his feet." I took a seat near the hearth. "Do you expect him to come here?" "Not yet, but he will circle. Listen for loose talk. And perhaps," he turned suddenly, crossing to the mantel where he retrieved the folded lozenge wrappers. "He will send another message." He paused, then opened his violin case not for the instrument, but for the hollowed cavity beneath the velvet lining. From it he produced a small, battered tin, the sort once used to store sealing wax. He pried it open and drew out a thin strip of paper, age-darkened, with faded pinholes barely visible even under the lamplight. "This," he said, "is something I kept from a case I never solved. 1892. The Silent Seer of Prague. A woman who claimed she heard plots whispered through illness. Everyone laughed. She died in her sleep. Natural causes, they said." I peered closer at the paper. "This is the same pattern." "Near identical," Holmes said. "Too precise to be coincidence. But it means this method has existed longer than we thought." We were still discussing possible cipher keys when the doorbell rang. Holmes froze. "Not expected," he said. "Not this hour." I rose, instinctively checking the revolver in my inner coat pocket. Mrs. Hudson appeared. "It's a child, Mr. Holmes. Says she's been paid to deliver something." Holmes stepped past her. At the threshold stood a girl no older than 11, with soot-smeared cheeks and hands stuffed into a tool-large coat. She held a sealed envelope out to Holmes. "From the man with the funny hat," she mumbled. Holmes took the envelope gently. "Did he give a name?" She shook her head. "Just said you'd know. Told me to walk slow, like I was just out for bread." Holmes handed her a shilling. "Tell your benefactor nothing more." The child nodded and vanished into the mist. Back inside, Holmes placed the envelope beneath the gas lamp. Its paper was thick, nearly parchment. No markings, no address. He held it to the light. "Nothing visible through," he muttered. Yet it was never meant to pass through the post. This was hand-carried. No folds, no creases. Someone wanted this delivered to us exactly as it left their hands. He broke the wax seal. Inside was a single sheet. On it were 3 things: a precise drawing of the lozenge wrapper spiral, with one alteration, a different center. Slightly displaced, a name written in block capitals: Henry Lestrade. A time: midnight. I frowned. Lestrade? Surely not Inspector Lestrade. Holmes was already pulling on his coat. Indeed, But if this is a warning or a lure, I must see him tonight. The hour is deliberate, just late enough for danger to mask itself as stillness. I followed quickly. Do you believe he's in danger? Holmes paused only to collect a small case of tools and a black silk scarf from his bureau. I believe, he said, that Inspector Lestrade has either been targeted or turned, and I intend to find out which before midnight strikes. We arrived at Lestrade's flat near Victoria Embankment just past 11. Holmes insisted we take the back stairs, less expected. He whispered, and we climbed in silence, each step creaking faintly under our weight. The hall was quiet. Holmes rapped lightly, no answer. He knocked again, sharper, still no reply. Holmes drew a thin metal pick from his sleeve and had the lock open in under 20 seconds. The door swung inward. We stepped into a modest sitting room with armchairs, a stack of police gazettes, and a kettle left cooling on the stove. A coat hung on the peg. He's home, I whispered. Holmes motioned me still. Then from the next room a sound, faint, like paper moving, or breath halting. Holmes stepped forward and pushed the bedroom door gently open. Lestrade sat slumped in a chair by the bed, his shirt open at the collar, one hand dangling limply, the other still clutching a folded wrapper. Lestrade, I cried, rushing forward. He stirred weakly. Holmes. His voice was hoarse, raw. Lie still, I said. You've been poisoned. Holmes took the wrapper from Lestrade's hand. Not poisoned, drugged, opium or belladonna. Designed to mimic collapse and loosen speech. Holmes turned to the lamp and examined the wrapper. It bore the spiral code again, this time punched more deeply. Who gave this to you? He asked. Lestrade coughed once, then muttered, Man in a red scarf. Said it came from Travers. I thought. It was a warning. Holmes frowned. It is more than that. It's a signal. To whom? To anyone still listening. He moved to the window and stared out across the fog-laced rooftops. Tonight, Watson, he said, someone tried to silence a whisperer who didn't even know he'd been drafted into the war. We've touched the core, now the rot inside the message, and I fear the next cough will not come quietly. And below, somewhere in the London mist, another match flickered to life. Chapter 7. The Whisper in the telegram room. It was nearly 2 in the morning when we left Lestrade's flat. Holmes walking briskly beside me, the cold mist curling through the gaslit streets like smoke from an unseen fire. The inspector, after some coaxing and a draught of laudanum, had fallen into a deep sleep. Holmes left a note for him pinned to the bureau, signed only with a sketch of a violin and the word "Listen." We turned toward Fleet Street, cutting through narrow alleys and silent lanes. Holmes was restless, his thoughts leaping ahead like candlelight on the walls of a moving carriage. Watson, he said suddenly, have you ever considered how a single false comma in a telegram might end a life? I can't say I have, I replied, breath fogging before me. And yet, he continued, a misplaced pause, an unintended repetition, or the illusion of routine. These are the brushstrokes with which our enemies paint death. We've been thinking of these messages as deliberate, but what if the brilliance of the system lies in its invisibility? What if they're hiding their missives inside official traffic, not beside it? I frowned. You mean encrypted within the actual telegrams? Holmes nodded. Consider this. A message from the ministry to a port authority may contain a list of shipping codes. But what if, say, the fifth letter of each line, or the type of cough recorded in a transmission ledger, carried alternate meaning? A buried rhythm lost in the noise. But that would require access to the ministry's live wire room, I said. Precisely. And our friend Lionel Harridge, as a senior cataloger, may have glimpsed that rhythm just enough to understand its danger. He turned down another alley. Where are we going? I asked. To the wire room. I stopped short. Holmes, it's closed at this hour. So are graveyards. Yet they remain occupied. The ministry's rear entrance on Dove Court was barred by a tall iron gate, flanked by a service hatch and a stack of crates. Holmes produced a small tension wrench and pick from his pocket, and within a minute the lock gave a quiet click. We slipped inside and crept down the back hall, passing rows of filing cabinets and wheeled trolleys of cable spools. At last we reached a thick, soundproof door with a brass plaque, "Wire Transmission Room, authorized staff only." Holmes held up a hand for silence, then leaned close to the door. I heard it to a faint hum, punctuated by soft clicking. "Morse," Holmes whispered. "Someone's transmitting, but at this hour," I said. Holmes pressed his ear again to the wood, then drew his magnifying lens and examined the lock. "We must enter, Watson, quietly." He worked at the mechanism, and the latch turned with a soft snick. He eased the door open a crack. Inside, the wire room was a dim cavern of machines, relays, and spools. A row of operators' desks ran along the far wall, each paired with a telegraph console. Most were vacant, but not all. At the far end, hunched over a desk in the shadows, was a lone figure, tapping at a key with deliberate rhythm. He wore a dark uniform, and though his back was to us, I caught a glimpse of his collars mirrored with gray soot. Holmes nodded once, silently confirming my thought. Our pursuer from Whitehall. The man stopped typing suddenly, cocking his head. He had heard something. Holmes acted in an instant. He flung the door wide, stepping inside with calm authority. "Ministry audit," he said coldly. "Remain where you are." The man bolted. He swept a bundle of pages from the desk, scattering them like leaves, and dashed toward the fire exit. Holmes was after him at once. "Watson, the papers," he shouted. I gathered what I could slips of telegram forms. A torn ledger sheethand raced after Holmes. Down the stairwell we thundered, our footsteps echoing against stone. The man threw open the outer door and disappeared into the fog. Holmes reached the street, just seconds behind, but stopped short, scanning the mist. "Gone," he said, with quiet fury. He knew the building. Perhaps an employee once. I caught up, still clutching the bundle of scattered papers. "What do we have?" Holmes asked, taking them. We moved beneath a nearby Holmes spread the documents out against the side of a postbox. One page caught his attention, a routine coastal telegram, marked as low priority Bay Shore packet schedule. It listed vessel names, times, and codes. But one thing was odd. "Here," Holmes muttered. "Look at the fourth item. SS Adria R. 213. Confirmed manifest complete. Cough present. Cough," I repeated. "What sort of manifest note is that?" "It isn't one," Holmes said grimly. "It's a marker. That word appears in 3 of these logs. Always appended, hidden, and the rest false data, diversions. If the Adria truly docked at 2:13, then the real cargo may never have touched shore. It's possible the entire entry is camouflage code wrapped in schedule. He tapped the page. This is the rhythm Prentice warned us of, the frequency. Harridge must have found these fragments notes, like cough present, that no clerk would question. But someone upstairs noticed his attention. And tonight, I asked. Tonight, our runner was passing new data through the machine, perhaps unaware that Lionel's legacy had already begun to crumble. He folded the papers with care. We've confirmed the rot has roots, Watson, but we still lack its direction. Who leads them, and where do their messages converge? And the spiral? Holmes looked skyward, as if expecting the fog to part with an answer. It is a map, I believe not of place, but of pattern. And patterns can be broken. The child nodded and vanished into the mist. Back inside, Holmes placed the envelope beneath the gas lamp. Its paper was thick, nearly parchment. No markings, no address. He held it to the light. Nothing visible through, he muttered. Yet it was never meant to pass through the post. This was hand-carried. No folds, no creases. Someone wanted this delivered to us exactly as it left their hands. He broke the wax seal. Inside was a single sheet. On it were three things: a precise drawing of the lozenge wrapper spiral, with one alteration, a different center. Slightly displaced, a name written in block capitals, Henry Lestrade. A time, midnight. I frowned. Lestrade? Surely not Inspector Lestrade. Holmes was already pulling on his coat. Indeed, but if this is a warning or a lure, I must see him tonight. The hour is deliberate, just late enough for danger to mask itself as stillness. I followed quickly. Do you believe he's in danger? Holmes paused only to collect a small case of tools and a black silk scarf from his bureau. I believe, he said, that Inspector Lestrade has either been targeted or turned, and I intend to find out which before midnight strikes. We arrived at Lestrade's flat near Victoria Embankment just past 11. Holmes insisted we take the back stairs, less expected. He whispered, and we climbed in silence, each step creaking faintly under our weight. The hall was quiet. Holmes rapped lightly, no answer. He knocked again, sharper, still no reply. Holmes drew a thin metal pick from his sleeve and had the lock open in under 20 seconds. The door swung inward. We stepped into a modest sitting room with armchairs, a stack of police gazettes, and a kettle left cooling on the stove. A coat hung on the peg. He's home, I whispered. Holmes motioned me still. Then from the next room a sound, faint, like paper moving, or breath halting. Holmes stepped forward and pushed the bedroom door gently open. Lestrade sat slumped in a chair by the bed, his shirt open at the collar, one hand dangling limply, the other still clutching a folded wrapper. Lestrade, I cried, rushing forward. He stirred weakly. Holmes. His voice was hoarse, raw. Lie still, I said. You've been poisoned. Holmes took the wrapper from Lestrade's hand. Not poisoned, drugged, opium, or belladonna. Designed to mimic collapse and loosen speech. Holmes turned to the lamp and examined the wrapper. It bore the spiral code again, this time punched more deeply. Who gave this to you? He asked. Lestrade coughed once, then muttered, Man in a red scarf. Said it came from Travers. I thought. It was a warning. Holmes frowned. It is more than that. It's a signal. To whom? to anyone still listening. He moved to the window and stared out across the fog-laced rooftops. "Tonight, Watson," he said, "someone tried to silence a whisperer who didn't even know he'd been drafted into the war. We've touched the core, now the rot inside the message, and I fear the next cough will not come quietly." And below, somewhere in the London mist, another match flickered to life. Chapter 7. The Whisper in the Telegram Room. It was nearly 2 in the morning when we left Lestrade's flat. Holmes walking briskly beside me, the cold mist curling through the gaslit streets like smoke from an unseen fire. The inspector, after some coaxing and a draught of laudanum, had fallen into a deep sleep. Holmes left a note for him pinned to the bureau, signed only with a sketch of a violin and the word "Listen." We turned toward Fleet Street, cutting through narrow alleys and silent lanes. Holmes was restless, his thoughts leaping ahead like candlelight on the walls of a moving carriage. "Watson," he said suddenly, "have you ever considered how a single false comma in a telegram might end a life?" "I can't say I have," I replied, breath fogging before me. "And yet," he continued, "a misplaced pause, an unintended repetition, or the illusion of routine, these are the brushstrokes with which our enemies paint death. We've been thinking of these messages as deliberate, but what if the brilliance of the system lies in its invisibility? What if they're hiding their missives inside official traffic, not beside it?" I frowned. "You mean encrypted within the actual telegrams?" Holmes nodded. "Consider this. A message from the ministry to a port authority may contain a list of shipping codes. But what if, say, the 5th letter of each line, or the type of cough recorded in a transmission ledger, carried alternate meaning, a buried rhythm lost in the noise?" "But that would require access to the ministry's live wire room," I said. "Precisely. And our friend Lionel Harridge, as a senior cataloger, may have glimpsed that rhythm just enough to understand its danger." He turned down another alley. "Where are we going?" I asked. "To the wire room." I stopped short. "Holmes, it's closed at this hour. So are graveyards. Yet they remain occupied." The ministry's rear entrance on Dove Court was barred by a tall iron gate, flanked by a service hatch and a stack of crates. Holmes produced a small tension wrench and pick from his pocket, and within a minute the lock gave a quiet click. We slipped inside and crept down the back hall, passing rows of filing cabinets and wheeled trolleys of cable spools. At last we reached a thick, soundproof door with a brass plaque, "Wire Transmission Room, authorized staff only." Holmes held up a hand for silence, then leaned close to the door. I heard it to a faint hum, punctuated by soft clicking. "Morse," Holmes whispered. "Someone's transmitting, but at this hour," I said. Holmes pressed his ear again to the wood, then drew his magnifying lens and examined the lock. "We must enter, Watson, quietly." He worked at the mechanism, and the latch turned with a soft snick. He eased the door open a crack. Inside, the wire room was a dim cavern of machines, relays, and spools. A row of operators' desks ran along the far wall, each paired with a telegraph console. Most were vacant, but not all. At the far end, hunched over a desk in the shadows, was a lone figure, tapping at a key with deliberate rhythm. He wore a dark uniform, and though his back was to us, I caught a glimpse of his collars mirrored with gray soot. Holmes nodded once, silently confirming my thought. Our pursuer from Whitehall. The man stopped typing suddenly, cocking his head. He had heard something. Holmes acted in an instant. He flung the door wide, stepping inside with calm authority. "Ministry audit," he said coldly. "Remain where you are." The man bolted. He swept a bundle of pages from the desk, scattering them like leaves, and dashed toward the fire exit. Holmes was after him at once. "Watson, the papers," he shouted. I gathered what I could slips of telegram forms. A torn ledger sheet-hand raced after Holmes. Down the stairwell we thundered, our footsteps echoing against stone. The man threw open the outer door and disappeared into the fog. Holmes reached the street, just seconds behind, but stopped short, scanning the mist. "Gone," he said, with quiet fury. He knew the building. Perhaps an employee once. I caught up, still clutching the bundle of scattered papers. "What do we have?" Holmes asked, taking them. We moved beneath a nearby Holmes spread the documents out against the side of a postbox. One page caught his attention, a routine coastal telegram, marked as low priority Bay Shore packet schedule. It listed vessel names, times, and codes. But one thing was odd. "Here," Holmes muttered. "Look at the fourth item. SS Adria R. 213. Confirmed manifest complete. Cough present." "Cough," I repeated. "What sort of manifest note is that?" "It isn't one," Holmes said grimly. "It's a marker. That word appears in 3 of these logs. Always appended, hidden, and the rest false data, diversions. If the Adria truly docked at 213, then the real cargo may never have touched shore. It's possible the entire entry is camouflage code wrapped in schedule." He tapped the page. "This is the rhythm Prentice warned us of, the frequency. Harridge must have found these fragments notes, like cough present, that no clerk would question. But someone upstairs noticed his attention. And tonight?" I asked. "Tonight, our runner was passing new data through the machine, perhaps unaware that Lionel's legacy had already begun to crumble." He folded the papers with care. "We've confirmed the rot has roots, Watson. But we still lack its direction. Who leads them, and where do their messages converge? And the spiral?" Holmes looked skyward, as if expecting the fog to part with an answer. "It is a map, I believe, not of place, but of pattern. And patterns can be broken." He turned toward me. "We must find the next whisper, Watson, before someone coughs in the wrong direction and dies for it." Chapter 8. Holmes tests a theory. By the time we returned to Baker Street, the mist had thickened to a pale curtain, veiling the lamps outside and muffling the sound of the street. Holmes had spoken little during the ride back, but I could sense a sharpening of purpose in him, attention building behind those storm-gray eyes. He laid the salvaged telegrams on the desk and began to pace, one hand behind his back, the other toying with the folded spiral wrapper, as if the weight of it might tilt the scales of deduction. "Watson," he said suddenly, "we must consider the cough not as symptom or metaphor, but as trigger, a signal." I asked, setting down my coat. "A trigger," Holmes repeated, tapping his index finger against his temple. "In every confirmed death or disappearance, so far Harridge, Lestrade's near poisoning. The wire room runner there has been a moment when the word cough entered the record unnaturally. In telegrams, in whispered warnings, even in personal conversation. I believe we are dealing with a chain of conditioned responses, Watson. I frowned. You mean? The cough elicits an action. Exactly. Perhaps not always conscious. Not in the traditional hypnotic sense, but a pattern, rehearsed and drilled. A group taught to respond to stimuli encoded in language. A linguistic snare, Watson. I was silent a moment. And Harridge, was he part of it? Holmes shook his head. I believe he decoded it, or worse, was beginning to mimic it. That may have been enough to mark him. He turned abruptly toward the window. And I now suspect Miss Harridge's presence was not as incidental as we assumed. I stiffened. You think she lied to us? Not lied, but perhaps withheld. He was already reaching for his coat again. We're going to North Ealing. No, Holmes said. That would raise her guard. Instead, we'll draw the net tighter by using bait. By mid-morning, Holmes had arranged a message to be delivered to Miss Eliza Harridge via a discreet intermediary. It bore no name, only the following words. The Adrius manifest was not complete. The cough is not extinguished. Come to the clockmaker's shop on Lime Passage at 2 o'clock. We arrived at the address well before the hour. It was a dusty little storefront, squeezed between a tobacconist and a shuttered pawnbroker. The proprietor, an old client of Holmes's, welcomed us with a knowing nod and vanished into the back room, leaving us to the ticking of a dozen clocks and the faint scent of oil and brass. Holmes stood behind a half-shuttered glass case, his expression unreadable. She will come, he said. She must. The message was tuned to her frequency, half threat, half memory. I stared at him. And if she's innocent, then she walks away confused. But if she's not, we'll hear her cough. The front bell jingled sharply at 5 minutes past 2. Eliza Harridge stepped inside, her gray coat buttoned to the neck, her eyes scanning the clocks with faint apprehension. She did not see us at first. Holmes remained motionless, obscured by the ticking shadows. Then she spoke aloud, but softly. It was never about the manifest, she said. You're not dead, are you? Holmes stepped into view. She gasped, and then she coughed, not once, not twice, but 3 times, short and clipped. I instinctively reached for my revolver. Holmes held up a hand. Eliza, he said gently, there is no one else listening. You can stop. Her shoulders sagged. The color drained from her face. You don't understand, she whispered. I didn't know they would kill him. I thought he would just be silenced, discredited. That's all. Holmes approached slowly. Start from the beginning. She sank into a wooden chair near the counter, trembling. I was approached weeks ago. A man, he never gave his name. He said my brother had stumbled onto something dangerous, that he was sending messages beyond his clearance, drawing attention. They asked me to monitor him, record his movements, check what he ate, whom he met. I thought I was helping to protect him. And the wrappers? Holmes asked. He had them hidden. I didn't know what they meant until one day he let one fall on the table as if by accident. I picked it up, saw the holes, and that night someone left one on my pillow. Same spiral. No words. Holmes glanced at me. A message without a message. A test. Eliza nodded. They said I had passed. Then Lionel died, I said. Her lips trembled. And I knew I hadn't protected him. I'd handed him over. Holmes folded his arms. You were part of the signal chain, but only the outer loop. You were told to listen, not act. They watched your reactions. And Lestrade, I asked. Did you have anything to do with that? No. I didn't even know he was involved. I only ever reported on Lionel. Holmes knelt beside her. Eliza, he said softly, you may be the only link left between the fringe of this network and its core. That cough you just gave it. She nodded slowly. Do you know what it meant? She looked at him with glassy eyes. It meant, I'm listening. Holmes stood and turned to me. There it is, Watson. The structure. Words for the initiated and sounds for the ghosts. He looked down at Eliza once more. And now, we must turn their own frequency against them from the wall of clocks. A long chime sounded the half-hour gentle and final dot. Gazing into the gears, murmured, time at last to cough back. Chapter 9. A second attempt. The culprit strikes again. The confession of Eliza. Harridge changed the cadence of the case entirely. She was no longer simply the sister of a dead man, nor a bystander ensnared in the tremors of conspiracy. She had become the first living link in a chain that stretched through whispers, lozenges, and coded coughs. And, more critically, she had provided us with the language of response. Holmes wasted no time back at Baker Street. He laid out a wide sheet of butcher's paper on the floor, where he began diagramming what he now referred to as the cough protocol. Each tick marked not a word, but an intention. 3 coughs for I'm listening. 1 short, then a longer pause, followed by a double cough. Advance now. A hacking burst. Abort. They've reduced speech to breath, he muttered, pacing between notations. No ink, no handwriting, no record, just noise, woven into the air, and yet still so precise. And you plan to use it against them? Not yet, he said. First, we must draw out their next move. They are cornered now. They know someone is speaking out of turn. They will act soon, desperately and messily. She must remain exactly as she is, neither protected nor exposed. She will return home tonight. I raised an eyebrow. That hardly seems safe. Holmes gave a faint smile. That's precisely why they'll come. We posted a constable nearby in plain clothes, concealed in the alley opposite the Harridge residence. Holmes and I, meanwhile, made for the house ourselves just past nightfall, arriving under the cover of a light drizzle. Eliza welcomed us with a quiet nod. Her face, though pale, bore a new steadiness. There was guilt in her eyes, yes, but also resolve. Holmes inspected the study once more, paying particular attention to the back panels of the shelves and the mantelpiece. From the small recess behind the fireplace, he extracted something wrapped in cloth, a narrow blackened metal cylinder about the length of a cigar. What is it? I asked. An audio capsule, he replied. Steel casing, perforated at one end. I found it when we first visited, but left it in place. It was affixed behind the lozenge wrapper's bearer, I believe, that uses vibration instead of ink. He set it on the desk and turned to Eliza. When was this last moved? Never, to my knowledge. Lionel must have placed it there. Holmes nodded. Then, if it holds a message, it's meant for the inner ring, the core. He glanced at his watch. 9:15. They will not wait past midnight. We took our positions. Holmes extinguished all lights, save for the small lamp by the window. Its shade tilted just enough to cast a silhouette that might suggest Eliza still reading in the parlor. We then retreated to the rear of the study, behind a curtain, with a view of both the front door and the window. The rain picked up. Footsteps came and went on the pavement. Once a dog barked in the distance, but then even that fell quiet. Then at 11:42 a shadow dot, it moved past the front hedge and paused just beyond the window's edge. Holmes did not move. I felt my breath catch a knock. Soft 3 taps. Eliza stood, crossed the room, and opened the door a crack. A man stepped in. He wore a long brown coat and a damp cap pulled low. The scent of sulfur and tobacco entered with him. "Miss Harridge?" he asked softly. "Yes," she answered. He drew something from his Paquita paper wrapper and held it up like a badge. Holmes emerged. "Good evening," he said evenly. The man turned and ran. I was after him instantly, down the hallway and into the street, Holmes just behind me. Our constable, alerted by the noise, sprang from hiding and managed to intercept the figure at the edge of the alley. A struggle followed, brief but furious. Then the man was pinned, breathless, soaked, and furious. Holmes stepped into the gaslight and looked him over. It was Travers. His collar again was smeared with match ash. His hands bore faint burns. Holmes removed the paper from his pocket. It was another lozenge wrapper, blank, but for a deep spiral groove punched into it, the center marked with ink. "Did you come to check the message, Travers?" Holmes asked coldly. "Or to remove the last witness who could speak it?" Travers glared at him. "You have no idea what you're involved in." "Oh, I do," Holmes replied. "You are the relay passing the signal between those who know nothing and those who know too much. You activated Eliza. You shadowed Harridge. And tonight you returned to reclaim what was no longer yours. You can't prove it," he spat. Holmes tilted his head. "But you've brought me something better than proof. You've brought me a pathway." He turned to the constable. "Take him to Lestrade. Tell him this is the man who coughed against the Queen." Back in the study, Holmes turned the spiral wrapper in his hands. "They'll know, Watson," he said quietly. "They'll know he's been taken, and they'll accelerate." He turned to Eliza. "You did well, but now the real danger begins." I stared at Holmes. "What danger?" He placed the lozenge wrapper flat on the desk, beside the audio capsule. "This," he said, "is only one half of the signal." He stepped back and looked toward the window. "The reply is still waiting to be heard." Chapter 10. The clock that coughed the rain had passed by morning, leaving London glistening with puddles and smoke that rose lazily from chimneys. Holmes had not slept. He sat cross-legged on the carpet of the Harridge study, the lozenge wrapper and the strange, blackened audio capsule before him. His violin case lay open nearby, not for music, but for the small tuning fork and signal bell stored within. I returned with coffee and found him, holding the metal cylinder up to the light. Eyes narrowed. "It's a recorder," he murmured, before I could speak. "Or perhaps a trigger. The kind of tool one buries inside furniture and forgets until it remembers you." "Do you believe it contains a message?" I asked, handing him the cup. "I believe it waits for one," Holmes said, "and I intend to deliver it." He retrieved the spiral perforated wrapper and gently inserted it into a narrow slot at the cylinder's side, aligning its edge with a notch etched into the casing. "It fits too perfectly for chance," he said. "Lionel left a key and a lock in the same room. What remains to be seen is what happens when the door opens." He turned the device, and it gave off a low metallic click followed by a mechanical hum that grew louder. For a moment, nothing happened. Then we heard it, a soft, steady tick-tick-tick like the heartbeat of a worn-out clock. From within the metal capsule came a barely audible series of mechanical tones. Faint hissing, followed by a sequence of cough-like bursts. Holmes leaned in, eyes gleaming. Listen to the rhythm. One soft exhale, pause, to sharp ticks. A dragging tone. It's not Morse's acoustic layering. Like early cryptographic gramophones. He turned the device off and looked up. Watson, do you recall the old post office clock tower in Lambeth? I nodded. The one that always chimes a few seconds late. Precisely. It's the only tower in the ministry's domain whose timing was never corrected. An anomaly left to rust. But according to Lionel's archived notes, the spiral pattern on this wrapper mirrors the winding sequence of that very clock. He laid the wrapper atop a map of the city and traced the spiral's arc with a pencil. If we treat the spiral not as a code, but as a spatial echo, like a sound wave centered on a specific point, we arrive at a curious radius. Lambeth, the clock tower, is the eye of the spiral. This device was meant to respond to it. A clock tower, I repeated. What could be transmitted from that? Sound, Holmes said. Resonance. Perhaps the very sound of the tower itself, or something more clever still, a sound designed to activate. He stood. Come, Watson. If this capsule was placed here to await a reply, then somewhere, someone or something is still listening for it. By noon, we stood beneath the old clock tower in Lambeth, its sooty bricks cracked with time, its great face stuck at 11 minutes past 12. It hadn't struck a chime in nearly a decade. Holmes examined the base carefully, his fingers tapping along the rusted service panel beside the stairwell. Do you hear that? He said softly. I paused. The wind? No. Beneath it. There's a low oscillation, like a tuning drone. He pulled a small cylindrical device from his coda frequency detector of his own making and placed it against the base. The needle on its face trembled, then locked into a narrow band. 17 hertz, he whispered. Just below the range of human hearing. He turned to me. Someone is broadcasting from within this tower, not to speak, but to wake. I felt a chill run through me. To wake what? Holmes was already moving. We climbed the winding stairwell inside the tower, the smell of rust and damp stone growing stronger as we ascended. At the top, we emerged into the old bell chamber. The bell itself was gone, removed years ago, but in its place stood a strange contraption, a square steel table braced with copper coils and sound cones, its surface covered with crumpled lozenge wrappers, each one punched in a slightly different pattern, and above it, suspended from the rafters, was a speaker cone the size of a man's chest, wired to the table and faintly humming. A reply station, Holmes breathed. It plays tones received from capsules like Lionel's. Then, in turn, it amplifies those tones and releases them outward, encoded in vibrations. I stared at the pile of wrappers. So they've been replying all this time? Holmes nodded. Passing information across the city, beneath the noise. A cough here, a wrapper there. A reply from a rusted tower no one bothers to maintain. He opened a leather case and withdrew Lionel's capsule. We'll play it back, quietly, see if it triggers anything. He connected the capsule to the table's input port and turned the crank. A brief tick, then the same sequence of hissed coughs echoed from the speaker cone above. Nothing happened for a moment. Then a drawer in the steel table sprang open. With a snap. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Holmes took it carefully. The page bore no words, only another spiral. This time, at its center, was a single phrase. "The tongue sleeps in dust." Holmes stared at it for several seconds, then slowly folded the page. "They are trying to shut it down, Watson. The cough is no longer just a code, it's a death rattle." He looked back at the silent speaker. "And we've just whispered into its ear." As we descended the tower, I asked, "Do you believe we've been heard?" "Oh, undoubtedly," Holmes replied. "Will they come?" He stopped at the base, turning to me with a glint in his eye. "They already have. Now they'll come to silence." Chapter 11. The Silent Listener. We returned to Baker Street in the late afternoon, the light slanting amber through the high windows, though the warmth it promised never reached the floorboards. Holmes remained standing as I poured 2 cups of tea, his untouched as he stared out the window, not watching the street, but listening to it. "They know," he said at last. Our presence in the tower was not quiet. Somewhere, someone heard the cough. "You believe we triggered them?" I asked. "I'm certain of it," Holmes replied. "We activated a reply system, perhaps long dormant, perhaps intentionally preserved, like a powder keg left beneath a parliament building. And now someone knows the spark has been lit." He turned from the window. "The question is not if they will respond, Watson. It is how, soon, and through whom." Our answer came not from the door, but from the wire. Shortly after 6 o'clock, a knock at the door announced the arrival of a telegram, hand-delivered, not by the usual boy, but by a man in a weathered green coat who offered no name. He left the envelope in my hands, tipped his hat, and vanished down the steps before I could call after him. Holmes took it wordlessly and broke the seal. He unfolded the telegram slowly, scanning its contents with practiced stillness. "To Mr. Sherlock Holmes, from the one who listens from below the tongue cannot wake what has no breath. The echo is a lie. Return to the fireplace. Listen there. S. Asterisk, asterisk, Holmes. Read it twice before handing it to me." I frowned. "The fireplace?" I asked. "Harridge's study." Holmes nodded. "There is something else in that room, something we missed." He was already reaching for his coat. The streets of North Ealing were nearly deserted when we arrived. Eliza greeted us with a nervous glance, but said nothing. Holmes had sent word for her to stay in the kitchen and lock the back door until summoned. We entered the study, and Holmes went immediately to the hearth. He crouched beside it, examining the brickwork with his lens. "There," he muttered, pointing to the side wall of the fireplace. "Mortar line barely noticeable. And this brick is scorched in a pattern inconsistent with the others." He tapped it twice, and the brick shifted slightly inward. From behind it came a faint clink, and Holmes withdrew a small, soot-dusted brass object, capped at both ends and bearing a curious engraving along its side, a single spiral that tapered into a question mark. He turned the cylinder in his fingers. "No latch," he said. "It opens with pressure." He pushed at the cap. It gave way with a sharp snap, and inside was a tightly rolled piece of parchment. Holmes unfurled it on the desk. A thin sheet carefully inked bearing a sequence of strange marks. Not writing, I said. No, Holmes agreed. Musical notation. Indeed, across the page ran a series of slashes, dots, and arcs. Not a melody, but a rhythm-timed intervals with breath marks scattered among them. A timing key, Holmes whispered. This was the original, the one the spirals imitate. This isn't just a message, it's a code base. I peered closer, and these symbols, each one corresponds to a form of exhalation, coughs, wheezes, silence. A full language, Watson, rendered in rhythm. Harridge didn't merely discover a pattern, he uncovered a grammar. This is the Rosetta Stone. Holmes moved to the desk and spread out the older wrappers, placing the parchment beside them. It's clear now. The replies were sent to see who was still listening. But this, he tapped the parchment, this is the call to silence. It's the last message, the final command. I shivered. A command to whom? Before Holmes could answer, a sharp rapping came at the front door. 3 precise knocks. Holmes froze. That's not Elisa, I whispered. No, he said. That's a signal. He moved to the window and peered through the curtain. One man overcoat, standing just beyond the lamplight. He turned to me. Take the pistol, Watson. I'll go. I nodded, revolver drawn but hidden beneath my coat. Holmes opened the door. The visitor was gone. Middle-aged, with a hat drawn low and a scarf wrapped around his throat. He held nothing in his hands, though I noted the slight bulge beneath his coats, something long and narrow. He coughed once, softly, then he spoke. You shouldn't have answered, he said. His voice was dry, faintly wheezing. Holmes regarded him calmly. Nor should you have whispered in a city full of ears. The man gave a slow smile. You've disturbed the chain. Travers was reckless, but you've taken the signal and cracked it like glass. Do you think we wanted this scene? I think, Holmes said, you should tell me who we are. The man's smile vanished. We are not named, only heard. And you've echoed too loudly. Holmes stepped forward. You sent the telegram. No, I am, the reply. You weren't meant to hear it. But now that you have, the language must fall silent again. He moved. Holmes was faster. He seized the man's wrist, twisting it sharply, the concealed blade in the coat sleeve. The stranger snarled, lunging. But Holmes drove a knee into his midsection and forced him down. I rushed forward, revolver raised. Holmes pinned the man against the wall and looked into his eyes. You're not the speaker, he said. You're just the whisper passed along. So who's listening now? The man said nothing. He coughed again this time, deliberately. 3 short bursts, a pause, 1 long wheeze. Holmes stepped back. Watson, he said, get Eliza and fetch the candle from the desk, quickly. I obeyed at once. Holmes turned back to the man. You've just sent your last message, he said quietly, and we're going to follow it. The man gave a crooked grin. Then you'll hear everything. Holmes looked at me as I returned with the candle. Watson, he said, we're going underground. And he turned the wick of the flame toward the parchment until the breath marks began to vanish, revealing what lay hidden beneath. Chapter 12. The words that breathed below. Lestrade frowned. Only a faint sound, like someone whispering from the corridor. A cough? Holmes asked. Lestrade blinked. Now that you mention it, yes. 2 of them, quick ones. Didn't think anything of it. I assumed it was the boy, delivering the wrapper. Holmes gave a grim nod to coughs, the code for execution. Lestrade paled further. "You've been used, Inspector," Holmes continued, "but not as a target trailer, as a transmitter. They sent you a signal, knowing that you would carry it here, not in words, but in rhythm. That wrapper you held was never a warning, it was the message. You inhaled the command, and then you passed it to me." Lestrade stiffened. "Then why am I still alive?" "Because you didn't cough back," Holmes said. He moved to the table and laid down the newest wrapper retrieve from the man who had come to silence us the night before. It too bore a variation of the spiral, but this one contained an extra turn at the center. Holmes tapped it. "This is the moment I realized we were never the target. The signal was meant to see who would respond. Those who coughed in return, those who understood, were identified and marked." He turned to me now. "Watson, this entire network isn't just a chain of command. It is a filter, one that selects for obedience through breath alone. Harridge, Prentice, Elizabeth, they all heard it, but only Lionel resisted." Lestrade sat heavily, and now, Holmes said, "we force their reply." He returned to the desk and fitted the original reel back into its casing. "We shall transmit one final message." I looked at him. "What will it say?" He gave a small smile. "Nothing at all." That night, Holmes and I returned to St. Agatha's under the cover of dense fog. Holmes brought the reel machine, now modified. Instead of playing the cough loop, he had recorded a perfect silence, layered with random fluctuations, pauses, sighs, the sound of stillness itself. A linguistic blank slate. Inside the bell chamber. He mounted the machine and pressed the switch. We stood together, unmoving. As the soundless pattern echoed into the night broadcasting, a message only the obedient would fail to understand. After a long moment, Holmes turned to me. "Now we wait, Watson. If they listen, they will panic, and those who panic reveal themselves." I swallowed. "And if they don't?" Holmes's expression hardened. "Then we find the next spiral. Because this city has not coughed its last." Chapter 14. Holmes closes in. The final clue revealed the day after Holmes broadcast his blank message from St. Agatha's Tower. London stirred with strange discomfort. It was not a city made for silent steam whistles, carriage wheels, shouting hawkers, and iron shoes on cobblestone formed its usual chorus, but something about the streets felt wrong. The noise was present, yes, but lacking something essential, something human. Even Mrs. Hudson commented as she brought in our tea, "Odd morning. Mr. Holmes, not a single cough or sneeze from the street." Holmes looked up from his writing with narrowed eyes. Indeed, like a choir that knows it's being watched. He set aside his pen and crossed to the mantel, where he tapped the barometer absently. "We sent a message without content, Watson, and now we wait for those who notice absence more than presence." "And do you believe they'll respond?" I asked, sipping tea. "They must. A system built on rhythm cannot tolerate a gap in the beat. The silence will provoke them." He returned to his desk and unfolded the latest ciphered wrapper, retrieved from the agent caught outside Harridge's home. Beneath the spiral were notations we hadn't seen before, tiny indentations pressed into the pulp of the paper with a tool rather than a pin. "What do you make of these?" I asked, leaning in. "They're timing marks," Holmes said. "Not part of the spiral itself. but guides for transmission small calibrations to ensure synchronicity with the master loop. He ran a gloved finger across the indentations. This wrapper wasn't used to receive a message. It was meant to deliver one, to wear. Holmes said nothing at first. Then he stood abruptly and pulled down a well-worn gazetteer from the shelf. "I've seen this rhythm before," he muttered, flipping pages. "Not in print, but in bells." He tapped the table twice, then again, after a short pause, "St. Dismas of the Bell Dockside. Their bell pattern is Unica, maritime chiming system used to coordinate port loading. Their ringmaster went mad, if you recall. Claimed to hear messages in the echoes." "That was 6 years ago," I said. Holmes nodded. "And yet it fits. What if the coughing protocol didn't originate in Parliament halls or ministry mailbags, but from the port side? A system built to manage noise, then converted into one of control." He slammed the book shut. "We go to St. Dismas." The dockside air was dense with salt and smoke, the Thames slapping against hulls with indifference. St. Dismas stood like a forgotten sentinel at the edge of the Keats's spire, blackened by soot, its clock face obscured by layers of grime. A rusty placard still read, "St. Dismas of the Bell, whisper nitrogen monoxide." The nave had long since been repurposed into a storage loft. Ropes and crates lined the floor. A lone iron bell, cracked and leaning, rested on a block where the altar once stood. Holmes walked in slowly, hat in hand. "The man who tuned these bells," he murmured, "was said to have had perfect pitch. He trained pigeons to react to tone shifts. The ministry dismissed him after he claimed he could make men sleep by ringing the third and sixth bells together." "Was he mad?" I asked. "Perhaps, but perhaps he simply listened too long." Holmes led me through the vestry into the bell tower stairwell. The ascent was narrow, winding. At the top, we entered a soot-streaked chamber, its air thick with mildew and damp brass. At the center was a small mechanical apparatus, a punch clock connected to a coil of copper wire and a sand-filled timer. Next to it lay a box-plane, wooden, locked with a single brass latch. Holmes knelt beside it and examined the lock. "Same tool marks as the wrapper's indentations," he said. "This is a response unit, set to chime when activated by matching frequencies." He produced a key one I recognized as having been retrieved from the custodian's chain at St. Agatha's and inserted it into the box. With a satisfying click, it opened. Inside was a notebook. Holmes removed it carefully, then opened to the first page. The handwriting was tight, feverish. "The machine is not the message. The message is the rhythm that survives the machine. The final spiral contains the correction. To break the code is to halt the echo. One must cough the lie backward." Holmes sat back. "It's a reverse pattern, Watson. The final wrapper, the last one given to the agent outside Harridge's door, is not a continuation of the spiral, but a mirror." He pulled it from his coat and laid it atop the notebook. Then, with precise movements, he traced it backwards, spiraling inward from the edge. "The pattern collapses in on itself," he whispered, "like a breath reversed, like speech unwound." I stared at him. "And what does it mean?" Holmes looked up at me with sudden clarity. "It's the shutdown protocol, Watson. The silence isn't the death of the code, it's escape clause. Lionel didn't want to defeat the cough system through confrontation. He wanted to invert it, make it deaf to itself." He stood quickly. "If we rebroadcast the final spiral in reverse, the obedient agents The ones who respond by instinct will stop. Stop what? Everything. I felt a cold weight settle in my chest. You mean? Collapse. Collapse. Disengage. Perhaps even disappear. I suspect it was designed for self-pruning, cutting infected limbs before they spread beyond control. And Lionel knew. He built it, or finished it, at least. Holmes folded the notebook and placed it in his coat. We go back to the tower. And what do we broadcast this time? Holmes gave a small, grave smile. We broadcast a cough they cannot answer. And outside, across London, the quiet was deepening unnaturally, so as if the city itself were turning an ear toward a sound it had not heard in years, or perhaps feared it might hear again. Chapter 15. The final gathering night had come once more to London, but it was not a natural dark. The fog that coiled over the rooftops felt drawn not by wind or pressure, but by something deeper, like breath inhaled and never released. As Holmes and I ascended the steps to St. Agatha's Tower for the last time, I could feel it. The city was holding its lungs, waiting. We reached the bell chamber shortly before midnight. Holmes moved with focused stillness, placing the final wrapper, the mirrored spiral, into the modified reel device. The notebook from St. Dismas sat beside it, open to the page bearing the phrase, "Cough the lie backward." He adjusted the settings carefully, reversing the playback coil. The speaker tuned to a resonance he calculated by hand. "You're certain this will work?" I asked, the question feeling heavier than I intended. "No," he said, "but I am certain that not acting is no longer safe. If Harridge is to be believed, and I believe he died proving it, this signal was always meant to collapse the system upon itself. A failsafe, like an empire taught to vanish at a single horn blast." Holmes turned the crank, the machine's hum rising like breath held before a whisper. "When I begin playback," he said, "we will not speak. The frequencies must unfold uninterrupted. Silence is no longer safety, it is the conduit." I gave a short nod and stepped aside, revolver in my coat, heart thick in my chest. Holmes flicked the switch. At first, there was nothing but a low, tonin, inaudible weight on the ear, like being beneath water. Then came the reversed coughs, sharp, unnatural expulsions played backward into wheezing inhalations. They did not sound like breathing, they sounded like unbreathing. Each burst of noise carried a rhythm unlike anything living. It did not speak to the body, but to something deeper. Habits forged in silence, movements taught through repetition. A cough, a pause, a signal. Reversed. Holmes watched the speaker cone with still intensity. "Now," he whispered. He reached into his coat and retrieved the original lozenge wrapper, Lionel's first message. He held it over the flame of the gas lamp and let it burn. As the ash curled into the air, something strange happened. The room grew quieter, not merely less noisy, but devoid. The very walls seemed to lean inward. No street sounds reached us. No gulls, no wind, no breathing. Then Holmes pointed to the edge of the chamber. "They're here." And they were. Figures began to appear in the stairwell doorway, one by one. Men and women, coats buttoned high, scarves drawn tight. Their faces were expressionless. Some I recognized: the man who had come to kill Eliza, one of the ministry clerks who had once dismissed Lionel. One, I swear, was the girl who delivered our telegram. Each stood still, eyes hollow, waiting. Holmes did not speak. He adjusted the volume of the machine, The spiral continued in reverse. I watched in mute awe as the first of the whisperers, the man from Eliza's doorstep, collapsed to one knee. Not in pain, but in surrender. He bent forward, as if listening more closely, his hands shaking. Then another fell. A woman clutched at her own throat, eyes wide, as if hearing words inside herself. Another backed away, twitching, and struck the doorframe before going still. "Holmes," I murmured, "what is happening?" He answered, without taking his eyes off them, "They are trained to follow the spiral forward. But this tells them to stop. It strikes the very foundation of their rhythm. They cannot process it, because it asks them not for action, but for stillness." He turned the dial again. All at once, the man on the floor began to speak. It was not a speech. It was a recitation protocol. 9 instructions rescinded. Return to silence. Then he gasped. One sand collapsed fully. One by one, they all followed. None died. But none remained awake. Each body slumped or slid to the floor, as if the strings holding them had been severed by a note only they could hear in the chamber. The coughs played backward one last time, then silence. Powered down the machine and stepped away from it like a man leaving a cathedral. "It's done," he said. I knelt beside the closest of them, the first man. His pulse was steady, his face relaxed. "They're sleeping." Holmes nodded. "The spiral has been rewritten, the loop broken. They may wake, yes, but they will no longer hear what they once did, and the code." He looked down at the ashes on the floor, gone with the last cough. By sunrise, Lestrade and a team from Scotland Yard had taken the whisperers into protective custody. No charges would be filed. There was nothing to charge. Not yet, but Holmes provided documentation of every cipher, every wrapper, every machine. He handed over the notebook from St. Dismas, the real. Even the custodian's key. The Yard would bury it, I knew. They always did. But as Holmes and I stood outside St. Agatha's once more, watching the fog peel away from the river, I saw a strange calm in his face. "You've silenced them," I said quietly. He shook his head. "No, I've given them silence. What they do with it is no longer mine to decide. And the system will reform," Holmes said. "They always do. But next time, I suspect it won't be breath they use." We turned toward the street, where the day had already begun anew. A horse's hooves struck the cobbles. A milkman whistled out of tune, and from somewhere far off, a cough sounded. Holmes paused, eyes narrowing. But it was only that, just a cough. This time, no reply came. Chapter 16. The cough that was never heard. It was 3 days after the final broadcast from St. Agatha's Tower. London, like a great machine roused from a brief pause, had returned to its customary din. The bells resumed their chiming, the soot-streaked carriages clattered across stone, and along every fog-laced street, life moved as if nothing had stirred beneath its skin. But in the silence Holmes and I had shared, particularly in those quiet hours before dawn, I knew better. Something had shifted. Not a wound inflicted, but a whisper excised, and yet London did not notice. Holmes sat opposite me that morning at Baker Street, his violin cradled under his chin, drawing out a long, uncertain melody, low notes, reluctant intervals, pauses, as though he expected the music to answer him. He had not spoken much since the night of the transmission. No congratulation, no triumph, only thought. "You never told me," I said at last. setting my teacup on its saucer, what that final phrase truly meant. The one we saw again and again in the spiral. The tongue sleeps in dust. Holmes played one final note, soft and vibrating, before lowering the instrument. Because it was never the message, he said. It was the mask of the message. I tilted my head. But it was central to the code. The phrase repeated across every wrapper, every pattern. Holmes walked to the mantel and unrolled the final cipher, the mirrored spiral that had collapsed the network. Indeed, but that line was no more meaningful than a rhythmic pulse. It was designed not to be understood, but replicated. You don't read it, Watson, you breathe it. He pointed to the phrase etched at the spiral's center. The words now so familiar, I could almost mouth them by instinct. The tongue sleeps in dust, a sentence that passes through the lungs like ritual. Each syllable structured with breath in mind. Lionel Harridge understood that. He saw the spiral not as an intellectual puzzle, but a physiological one. A pattern to be obeyed rather than deciphered, I said slowly. Holmes nodded. That was the genius of the system. By embedding obedience in breath, they created a message that could not be intercepted. It lived inside the body, unspoken, passed along with a cough. He folded the wrapper carefully and slid it back into its envelope. But Harridge changed that, I said. He sabotaged the rhythm. No, he completed it, Holmes replied, turning back toward the fire. He didn't destroy the code, he reversed its intention. Where it once compelled obedience, he inserted interruption, a flaw, a breathless pause that taught its followers not to act. And you found it, broadcast it back. Holmes gave a rare, quiet smile with his help. Outside, the sun was climbing behind layers of pale cloud. London looked as it always did in the morning, indifferent, vast, ordinary. But I found myself staring out the window as though expecting to see something more. A figure watching, a shape disappearing into the fog. I thought of Eliza Harridge. She had left the city under Holmes's arrangement 2 nights earlier, to a quiet home by the sea far from telegraph poles and underground corridors. Before departing, she had left a note on Holmes's desk. He only wanted the silence to mean something again. He was right, wasn't he? I said aloud. Lionel, there was no grand conspiracy in the end. No central mastermind. Only a message passed too long without question. Holmes nodded slowly, like a prayer recited by those who've forgotten its meaning. The spiral outlived its creators. The chain kept moving, not because anyone still willed it to, but because the pattern was trusted more than thought. I looked at him. And now, Holmes exhaled. Now the loop is broken, not through destruction, but through reflection. Those who obeyed instinctively were made to listen to themselves. In doing so, they heard nothing, and the silence undid them. He walked to the bureau and opened the bottom drawer, placing the spiral envelope inside beside a stack of old tobacco tins and an unlit candle stub. No more replies will come, he said. At least not in that tongue. There was a pause as we returned to our seats. What of the custodian? I asked. The old man at St. Agatha's. We never saw him again. Holmes stared into the fire. No, he said quietly. We never did. You think he was part of the system. Perhaps he was the system, a keeper of the rhythm, a fragment left behind when the rest of the chain dissolved. Or maybe he was just another soul trained to stand vigil in silence, waiting for a cough that would never come. A knock sounded faintly at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered with the afternoon post, 2 letters, and a thin parcel wrapped in cloth. "This came by hand," she said, laying the parcel before Holmes. No return name. Holmes opened it slowly. Inside was a matchbox. Beneath it, a single lozenge wrapper, blank. No punctures, no spiral. Only one line, handwritten in tight lettering: "You were heard." Holmes read it without expression, then passed it to me. I looked up. "From one of them, perhaps," he murmured, "or from someone watching from beyond." He placed the matchbox into the fire. The wrapper he folded neatly and slipped into the inner pocket of his coat. Messages often outlive their authors, Watson. But perhaps now finally we have reached the last reply. We sat in silence for a long moment. Then, from the street below, came the faint voice of a boy hawking papers. Storm over Europe. Prussian lines vibrating again. Holmes's eyes flickered upward. Vibrating, I smiled. Surely just headline exaggeration, perhaps, but he leaned forward slightly, as if straining for some rhythm beneath the cry. Then, satisfied, he sat back. The clock on the mantel chimed once. I poured us both a fresh cup of tea, and just as I brought the cup to my lips, I heard it, a cough, far off, faint. Holmes turned, but didn't rise. He met my gaze calmly. "Watson," he said, "not every cough is a message." And for the first time in days, I believed him, because this one had no rhythm, and no reply followed, only breath.